The kitchen chairs scraped across the linoleum in perfect formation, arranging themselves around the table, while Richard watched from the doorway, his bare feet cold against the floor. Every piece of furniture in the house began sliding and rotating, the couch spinning counterclockwise while the dining room hutch walked itself into the center of the room on invisible legs. The grandfather clock in the hallway tilted backward at an impossible angle, its pendulum swinging horizontally as if gravity had abandoned only that corner of the house. Richard's reflection in the hallway mirror turned to face him directly, while his physical body remained motionless, the mirror self raising one finger to its lips in a shushing gesture before pointing toward the stairs. The children's bedroom door stood open at the top of the landing, soft giggles drifting down like poisoned honey. Each step creaked under his weight as he climbed, the sound echoing wrong, as if the house itself was warning him to turn back. The scene in Mia and Christopher's room defied every law of nature he'd ever accepted. The infamous Chucky doll sat cross-legged on the carpet between his sleeping children, its plastic hands moving with fluid precision as it built an elaborate tower from their wooden blocks. When Richard appeared in the doorway, those painted blue eyes shifted to meet his gaze, and the doll's stitched mouth curved into a knowing smile. "Daddy's awake," Chucky said in a voice like grinding glass. "Good." We were just getting started. The blocks continued stacking themselves higher, forming letters that spelled out words Richard had never told anyone. Vietnam, Jenny, pills, basement. The secrets he'd buried for 15 years, arranged in perfect wooden typography while his children slept on, their breathing deep and untroubled. "You remember Jenny, don't you?" The doll's head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Pretty little thing. Shame what happened to her in that hotel room in Saigon." Richard's legs gave out, sending him to his knees in the doorway. The medication bottles he'd hidden behind the water heater rattled in their plastic containers 2 floors below, the sound carrying impossibly through walls and distance. His hands shook as the doll continued its accusations, each word a nail driven into the coffin of his carefully constructed life. "The children know," Chucky whispered. "They've always known. Haven't you, my little friends?" Mia's eyes opened first, completely white, no iris or pupil visible. Then Christopher's, the same milky blindness reflecting the dim hallway light. They sat up in perfect unison, their heads turning toward their father with mechanical precision. "We know about the bad things, Daddy," Mia said in a voice not her own. "We know about Jenny," Christopher added, his words hollow and echoing. The block tower collapsed with a thunderous crash that should have woken the entire neighborhood, but the silence that followed felt thick and muffled, as if the house existed in a bubble separate from the rest of the world. Richard tried to speak, to deny everything, but his throat had closed completely. Chucky stood with inhuman grace, its overalls rustling as it walked between the children toward Richard. Each footstep left a small burn mark in the carpet, the synthetic fibers melting and blackening under those tiny plastic shoes. The smell of scorched material filled the air, acrid and choking. "Jenny visits me sometimes," the doll continued conversationally. "Down in that basement where you keep your little shrine. She told me such interesting stories about that night. About the needle, about how you watched her convulse for 7 minutes before calling for help." The walls began to weep, thick red tears running down the faded wallpaper in rivulets that pooled on the baseboards. The children watched with their terrible blank eyes, their small hands clasped in front of them like they were attending a funeral service. Their bedroom window overlooked the backyard where Richard had buried the evidence 15 years ago. But now the glass showed only swirling darkness, as if the outside world had simply ceased to exist. The pills were supposed to help with the nightmares, Richard managed to whisper, the words scraping out of his throat like broken glass. Oh, they helped, Chucky laughed, a sound like children screaming. They helped you forget. They helped you pretend. They helped you build this nice little life with these nice little children. But Jenny never forgot. The temperature in the room plummeted. Richard's breath came out in visible puffs as frost began forming on the windows. The children's skin took on a bluish tinge, but they showed no signs of discomfort, continuing to stare at him with those horrible, empty eyes. From the basement came the sound of footsteps, slow and measured, climbing the stairs. Each footfall echoed through the house like a death knell. Richard knew those footsteps, had heard them in his dreams for 15 years. Jenny was coming home. She wants her justice, Chucky said, settling back down among the scattered blocks. And these beautiful children are going to help her get it. Mia and Christopher began to smile, their lips stretching far too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that belonged in no human mouth. Their fingernails grew longer as Richard watched, becoming claws that scraped against their pajamas with tiny ripping sounds. The footsteps reached the first floor, paused, then continued upward. Richard could smell her perfume now, that cheap floral scent Jenny had always worn, mixed with the copper tang of blood and the sweet stench of decay. His medication rattled more violently in the basement, the bottles dancing against the concrete walls like imprisoned spirits demanding release. You can't run from this anymore, Chucky whispered. You can't hide behind your pills and your lies and your perfect little family. Jenny's coming, and she's bringing friends. Through the bedroom walls came the sound of multiple footsteps, dozens of them, ascending from some impossible depth. The other victims, Richard realized with horror. All the girls whose names he'd pushed down into the dark corners of his memory with pharmaceutical assistance. They were all coming back. The children rose from their bed in perfect synchronization, their movements puppet-like and wrong. Their feet didn't quite touch the ground as they glided toward him, their arms outstretched, their mouths still stretched in those terrible grins. Behind them, Chucky began to laugh again, the sound building and building until it filled the entire house. "Welcome home, Daddy," they said in unison, their voices layering together into a chorus of the damned. Time to play. The hallway behind Richard erupted in flames that burned cold instead of hot, blue fire that gave no light but cast everything into deeper shadow. The footsteps had reached the second floor now, and he could see shapes moving in the darkness at the end of the hall. Women in the various states of decay, their eyes reflecting that same cold fire, their mouths open in silent screams. Jenny stood at their center, exactly as she had looked 15 years ago, except for the needle still protruding from her arm and the dark stains spread across her white dress. She raised one pale hand and pointed directly at Richard, her finger steady and accusing. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying the weight of graves. Miss me? Richard's world fractured completely then, the careful construction of denial and self-medication crumbling like a house of cards. The children weren't his children anymore, if they ever had been. They were something else wearing their faces, something hungry and patient and utterly without mercy. Chucky wasn't a doll, but a vessel, a focus for all the rage and pain he'd caused, given form and purpose. The basement called to him, where his real children lay buried beneath the concrete floor he'd poured with his own hands, where the evidence of 15 years of carefully planned murders, waited in neat rows, trophies and mementos of a life lived in service to darker appetites than anyone suspected. "The game's over," Chucky announced, standing tall among the burning blocks. "Time to pay the price." As the dead closed in around him and his false children reached out with their impossible claws, Richard understood finally that this wasn't supernatural at all. This was justice, pure and simple, wearing the mask of nightmare because that was the only language his twisted mind could understand. The doll, the transformed children, the walking dead, all of it was his guilt given form, his conscience finally breaking free from pharmaceutical chains. In the basement, his real victims waited in their concrete graves. In the bedroom, his fantasy of normal life died with tooth and claw. And in the space between sleeping and waking, Richard faced the truth he'd been hiding from for 15 years. Monsters were real, and he had always been the worst one of all. The house burned with cold fire, and in the ashes, justice finally found its voice. The flames consumed nothing, yet devoured everything, peeling away the layers of Richard's carefully constructed reality like old paint. Through the supernatural conflagration, he saw his basement workshop as it truly was. Not the innocent storage space he'd shown neighbors, but a meticulous laboratory of death. Workbenches lined with surgical instruments, freezer units humming with their terrible cargo, filing cabinets filled with photographs, identification cards, and detailed notes written in his precise handwriting. Jenny stepped closer, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the burning floorboards. The needle in her arm glinted in the cold firelight, still connected to the syringe he'd used to inject her with enough heroin to stop her heart. Behind her, the other victims emerged from the shadows with their own props of murder. Sarah clutched the rope burns around her throat, while Patricia carried the hammer that had caved in her skull. 17 years old, Jenny whispered, her voice carrying across impossible distance. "That's how old I was when you picked me up outside the bus station. Hungry, scared, perfect." The children, his false children, began to change more dramatically. Mia's face elongated, her features melting and reforming into something ancient and predatory. Christopher's limbs stretched until his proportions became grotesque, spider-like. They were becoming what they had always been, manifestations of his own monstrous nature given form. Chucky walked through the flames without burning, his plastic features beginning to crack and peel away to reveal something underneath that was far worse than any toy. Writhing darkness leaked from the fissures, and within that darkness, Richard glimpsed eyes, dozens of them, the eyes of every victim he'd taken. "You thought the pills would wash us away," the doll said, its voice now a chorus of the dead. "But we were always here, Richard. Waiting, watching, growing stronger every time you swallowed your guilt." The basement door exploded outward, and his real workshop began rising through the floors like some hellish elevator. The concrete slab cracked open, revealing the neat rows of graves beneath. 23 victims in total, ranging in age from 16 to 28. All runaways, all forgotten by a world that had abandoned them long before Richard found them. The pills scattered across the burning floor began to dissolve, each capsule releasing a small wisp of trapped memory. Richard watched in horror as his carefully suppressed recollections materialized in the smoke. The hunt through bus stations and truck stops, the careful selection process, the elaborate staging of each death scene to look like overdoses or accidents. "You were so methodical," Patricia said, stepping through the flames with her crushed skull weeping dark fluid. "So professional." The police never suspected a thing, did they? The transformation of the house accelerated. Walls became transparent, revealing the true scope of his operation. The garage where he'd kept the van with its modified interior. The shed where he'd disposed of evidence. The garden where he'd grown the flowers that helped mask the scent of decomposition. Jenny raised her hand, and Richard found himself unable to move, paralyzed by the weight of accumulated guilt. The needle in her arm began to glow with cold light, and he realized she was offering him the same choice he'd given her 15 years ago. A quick death or a slow one. "The children in town have been having nightmares," she said conversationally. "Dreams about a man who smiles too much and drives a clean white van. Dreams about someone who offers candy and promises of safety. Their parents think it's just imagination, but children see truth more clearly than adults, don't they?" Chucky laughed, his cracked face splitting wider. He was planning to start again. "Weren't you, Richard? All those years of staying clean, of playing the perfect neighbor, but the urge never really went away." The medication bottles in the basement workshop exploded in sequence, each one releasing a different victim's essence into the cold fire. Their voices joined the chorus, creating a symphony of accusation that shook the house to its foundation. Richard could hear his real name being called, not the identity he'd assumed after Jenny's death, not the persona he'd crafted, but his true name from before he'd learned to kill. "William Hendricks," they chanted in unison. "William Hendricks, William Hendricks." The name hit him like a physical blow. He'd buried it so deep, had convinced himself so thoroughly that he was Richard Morrison, loving single father and community volunteer. But the dead remembered. They had always remembered. The false children reached him then, their claws extending toward his face. But instead of pain, their touch brought clarity, brutal, overwhelming clarity. Every suppressed memory flooded back at once. The planning, the hunting, the careful disposal. The families who'd never found their daughters. The investigations that had gone cold. The years of hiding behind medication and manufactured normalcy. "You can't kill what's already dead," Jenny said, her needle arm reaching toward his throat. "But we can make you live with what you've done. Really live with it. No more pills, no more lies. Just you and us and the truth. Forever." The house began to collapse, but not into rubble, into memory. The walls folded inward, trapping Richard in a recursive loop of his own crimes. He would experience each murder from both perspectives, his own satisfaction and his victim's terror. He would feel every moment of their pain while simultaneously reliving his pleasure in causing it. Chucky's laughter filled the dissolving space as the doll's true nature revealed itself. Not a possessed toy, but the physical manifestation of karma itself. dressed in the innocent form of a child's plaything to mock Richard's pretense of normalcy. "Welcome to your new family," the chorus of the dead sang as reality completed its inversion. "Welcome home, Daddy." The cold fire consumed the last of his false identity, and William Hendricks, serial killer, child murderer, monster, found himself exactly where he belonged, trapped forever in a house built from the bones of his victims, playing games that would never end.